Welcome to Pass the Mic, Let's Talk, an initiative of the Africa Center for Ideas program through Jade Communications. This is part of a series of conversations on constitutionalism. I'm John Sibi Okumu. My guest in this edition is a constitutional lawyer who was formerly a university lecturer and a member of the short-lived stroke defunct Constitutional Implementation Commission. He is now in private practice, but his public profile is maintained as a regular newspaper columnist on matters constitutional. Welcome, Mr. Kamotho Waiganjo. Kamotho, if I may.
You're doing it well.
Wemwega.
Thank you. It's good to be here, John.
Define our topic in your own terms. What is the rule of law which we have set out to discuss?
One understands the rule of law concept in terms of what it is not and what it is running away from. It is running away from the rule of men, as opposed to, well, it used to be men, it should be now a rule of men and women, to a rule by law, rule of law. And what it is running away from was the old concept of monarchism. You know, the rulers who knew everything and who had no boundaries and who had no limitations. The rule of law, constitutionalism, prescribes, recognizes the fact that even kings, even rulers, are required to be bound by law. And that the law is creates a set of institutions that the leaders are accountable to. So essentially, that whole concept is limiting the sort of autocracy and lack of the extreme power, exercise of power. So that is really what constitutionalism and rule of law are referring to.
May I be so bold as to add the notion of equality of every citizen, every mwananchi, Wanjiko, Atieno, Farida, before the law?
That precisely is it, that everyone is bound by law. It doesn't matter whether you're the ruler or the ruled.
Right.
In theory, the theory of it is that
Exactly.
everyone is bound by the law.
Well, I'll go back to your appeal to monarchies and absolute rulers, the big man syndrome. I want us to think continental and think, if we've always had chiefs, wanamukubwa, big men, is the idea of equality embedded in the rule of law alien to the African psyche generally?
I think we have to go through a transiting process from where we have looked up to kings and we have looked up to the men who knew everything and the men who solved all our problems, to recognize that even they are accountable to the sovereign, and the sovereign is no longer them, the sovereign is now us. But this is not a process that changes just because we write a constitution. Because the way human beings operate and the way human beings change is that it takes time, it takes experience. That is why that even today, even when we have problems in the nation, people still want, what has the president said? What is the president going to do?
That's what I'm saying. The African psyche is yearning for the big man.
Yeah,
so I'm saying maybe that this alternative thinking is an imposition. Democracy is not for us. Bring back the big men and all will be well.
We have realized, because we have seen them, the big men, and a couple of, well, not too many big women. We've seen them and we've seen them go wrong and we've seen them take countries to the dogs. So we've come to realize that they don't know everything. They're just as fickle as the rest of us, you know.
Define we.
We, I mean,
Kamotho Waiganjo, constitutional lawyer?
We the people.
We the people.
We the people who sat down in a period of like 20, 30 years and decided we want to be ruled differently. And this was not something that was left to the elite. You know, if you go around to Kisumu, if you go around to Muranga, if you go around to the coast, you will find that from the 80s, particularly towards the late 80s and the early 90s, people are saying maybe the rulers don't know everything, and maybe it's a time to allow a level playing field where the best are produced. But that doesn't mean that because we have written the law that suddenly the whole entire society changes. We will still eventually, every so often want to retreat to that which is familiar, which is the big man or big person who solves our problems. But the truth of the matter is the country is moving towards where Citizens have responsibilities. Citizens are the sovereign. Citizens hold leaders accountable, and the leaders are themselves responsible to account to the citizen. But that is a process.
Kamotho, before, let's just stay on the continent,
Yes.
huge as it is with all these 52, 53, 54 nation states. The accusation that Africans do not govern our own destinies, so that even if we appeal to concepts like the rule of law, there are superior machinations, sometimes by nation states which by themselves are very autocratic and do not practice democracy. But we're turning to them for loans, we're turning to them for supervision. Again, there seems to be a sort of disconnect there.
And that's a
You're
reality.
taking something from a bad person in kiddie terms.
Well, we've got to recognize that even all these concepts, even democracy, always have to recognize context, and that if you take them as a one shoe fit all, there will be pain. That's number one. Number two is that the reality is that in our world today, even the West is not itself, totally immune to the imposition of principles and concepts from others. One of the biggest things that has grown up in the West now is the role of technology and big data, and these companies that now, they manage media, they manage public opinion, and they are not accountable to anyone. So there's nothing unique about some of the challenges we have in Africa in terms of the fact that the West determines, to a very large measure, the direction of politics, the direction of our economy. A lot of these things are just the way the world works. I think what we have failed to understand is ultimately the destiny of this continent, the destiny of these countries is in our hands. So let us use the international instruments and recognize international realities, but ultimately the responsibility to make this country better is ours who live here. It is not them. And we cannot blame them if they take advantage of us. We cannot blame them that they try and exploit us. That is what most people in a position of power will do. So our responsibility is to push back. And I think what we have failed to do a lot of times is to push back. And part of the reason for that is sometimes even our leadership is compromised. There are personal benefits that come with working with institutions in the West, including private capital. So I think it is a failure to recognize the responsibility that is ours in leadership, and instead spend a lot of time blaming others for taking advantage of our own weaknesses, which I think is unfortunate.
As a journalist,
Yes.
this role of civic education, when you write your weekly column, which I read avidly, what messages are you trying to put across? I mean, why spend that time in the column inches?
I'm trying to say two things. One is that the problems of Kenya are a little more complicated than we're willing to recognize. And that a lot of governing is not about black and white. We don't have evil rulers and good rulers. We have a bit of both, across. And so we need to be able to extract the best from whoever it is who's on the market. And for me, what I want to do is help us try and assess how do we determine that we're getting the best we can from a bunch, which is not necessarily the best that we have, but how do we get the best out of the lot that nature has planted on us, and to help that conversation. And then number two, to say that we as citizens have the ultimate responsibility to ensure that this country functions. We can blame leadership, but a lot of times, 50%, 60% of the time, we have actually deliberately voted for those people, knowing we know the sort of people we would ever appoint to your local funeral committee. We vote them to run our countries, So I'm just saying there's a sense of citizen responsibility that we need to have. And I think that is part of what is lacking in our national conversation. What is the role of John C.B. Okomo as a citizen, as much other than blaming leadership? Yeah.
There are instances, if I may, where I'll quote you to yourself.
Yes.
Just to prove that I read what you write. In August 2020, to be more precise, you wrote, "The promise of the Constitution was generous, and we believed that finally Kenya would be a fairer, more just, empowering society with accountable, transparent leadership. How naive we were. The gap between delivery and promise has been humongous. In biblical terms, we have the letter of the Constitution without its corresponding power." Have your thoughts changed since August 2020?
If anything, they've become more affirmed. I think I probably operated from the naive assumption that if only we could change the law, if only we would have a progressive constitution, we would certainly have a progressive country and a better country. I realize now that it's a journey, and I think the biblical concept of new wine in old wineskins is very real. And that process of ensuring that the two are working together, people are generally not progressive. People don't automatically like change, even when change is in their favor. And to move people to the point, both the citizens and the leadership, to the point where you align them with very progressive constitutional standards, is a journey, is a very long journey. And a lot of it will not happen in our lifetime.
But sorry to interrupt, but
yes.
I set you up in a way when
yes.
I said you were a member
yes.
of the short-lived defunct Constitutional Implementation Commission.
Yes.
You were in the thick of the implementation process, and you backed out. That gesture of abandonment means that what you saw from within was so galling, so frustrating, that you said, let me go and write newspaper articles instead.
No, one we didn't go out. The Constitution sent us home, and Parliament refused to extend our term, which was fine. Parliament had told us from the beginning that we had become a headache, they were not going to extend our term, which was okay. I think we played the role we needed to play. But I think it is in that season, having been an outsider in civil society and in private sector, I assumed that government was going to be changed in this manner, in this form, by new rules and new processes. Having gone inside and now operated for 5 years within government, I recognize that this is a ship. It moves very, very slowly. It moves. And I think we need to also be positive in our outlook. We have moved. If you've been around here for the last 40 years, we have shifted, but it shifts very slowly. And I think for me, that was my Damascus Road moment, recognizing that it was not going to move as quickly as I had assumed. And now I was an insider, so I could see this process from an insider, as opposed to be someone attaching blame.
I take your point entirely. And as an insider, can you explain this eternal disconnect between the three arms of government, the executive, the legislature, the judiciary?
One, it is not unique. It's not unique to Kenya. Fights between the executive, the judicial, and the legislature, they're in the US. Right now, we have challenges between the judiciary in the US and the legislature. The reason why Joe Biden wants even to expand the size of the court is because the court is moving in a direction that the executive does not agree with. So there's nothing unique about that. And that process is there. Those three arms are there for a purpose. It is to act as checks on one another.
But who's to set the tone?
The terms
who's the big brother? Who's the senior cousin? Who's the big man?
The terms
the
are
big
set,
woman?
The terms are set, the man, for now. The terms are set by the Constitution. The Constitution gives each of these institutions their responsibility. And to that extent, each of them is superior in the exercise of their responsibilities. There is none that is superior in the other in that respect, because they all depend on each other. The president, for example, is a president, but he can be stopped by the courts. The courts may be, but they rely on money from the legislature. So,
Kamotho, you're the constitutional lawyer.
Yes.
I seem to think when I read the papers, not that it's in some sort of darkened vault, that there is a complete ignorance of court orders by the president, for one. Surely that's a nameable offence on a podium such as this. Are you going to say the time will come when this will change of its own accord?
I would hope so. I think there'll come a time. And sometimes I think there are two circumstances in which this happens. There are times when it is unfortunate because there's no reason. There's no reasonable reason before any panel on which the executive should refuse to obey court orders. But there are times also the courts are also not themselves, they do not do any self-reflection of the impact of their decisions, and it puts the executive in an awkward position. I'll give you a quick example. The court rules that the members of boards of parastatals and their chairman are in office illegally, and it says send them home. If you're the president, you send them home. That brings down institutions that are playing a constitutional and statutory role. What do you do? And the chief executive, the buck stops with you. And so in a sense, when you talk about codependence, is that institutions need to recognize that the decisions sometimes have far-reaching effect, and it makes it difficult sometimes to abide. But ultimately, unfortunately, the law requires everyone to abide by the law, in whichever form it comes.
Kamotho, very recently you wrote that on the issue of the appointment of judges, for example, that I think I read you correctly so many weekends ago, that the court was going to be swayed by public opinion, and that this was their prerogative. So the idea is that if all of us went out into the streets and holding banners saying, "Dear President, reinstate so many judges," it would happen the next day. Wouldn't the ship move slightly faster than you're suggesting?
That is precisely my point, that sometimes civic responsibility calls on us to recognize that even the courts, everybody listens to where the people are at. The impact of sovereignty is that the president listens to where the citizens are. Parliament listens. The judiciary, even though it pretends it doesn't, it listens to where people are. And as long as it's a reasoned conversation, it is not a conversation that's been hijacked by partisan politics. All institutions listen to the people. And I think people underestimate their power.
Somewhat questions. What has happened to Chapter 6 of the Constitution, which calls for integrity in our leaders?
I think that is the one if you talk about non-implementation, that is the one area we struggled. And we struggled at two levels. One is that we have not implemented that in terms of the appointive process, even the basis on which we vet people for public office. A lot of times Chapter 6 is ignored. But there's another related side, is that the citizens themselves have also not owned Chapter 6. Because when you do elections, you don't have to be told. You need to know. Nobody needs to stop someone from standing. You know, you don't have to be told that if you people allow John to stand, we are going to vote him in. It is a responsibility of the citizen also to recognize that Chapter 6 is also about them. It's also about who they should elect.
Well, then I ask you another question. What has happened to our right to protest?
Well,
Why are we clobbered when we sort of complain about ports in Lamu and congestion in Mombasa? That's a civic response to what you're saying.
It is.
And the response is ugly.
And you know, I mean, you read history. You know, rights have never been given. Rights have always been fought for, and fought for means there will be pain inflicted. But if something is important enough, you don't give up. We have gotten here because some people paid a price.
I'm not hearing you. Maybe I heard the wrong. Are you sort of suggesting that the panacea to our woes is a sort of French Revolution, Marie Antoinette thing? We have the revolution, then the bloodletting, then all that. Should we live through that?
No,
Should we live through a bloodbath before we see Nirvana and the promised land?
We have lived through bloodbaths, John.
In 2007.
Don't forget, not just even before, in 1992.
And so we should have a few bit
more.
No.
That is how we ended up with a new constitution. We now have a constitutional order. We're not talking about revolution. We're not talking about broad general revolutions. But we are saying there are certain principles where there are certain issues on which we need more organized civic action. You know, and civic action is not always about violence. You know, I mean, people write letters to members of parliament. People demonstrate. People stop members of parliament on the road and ask them to go and pass proper laws. There are many ways in which civic action is not about elections. We have elections in 2 years' time. What are the principles that are going to inform who we vote for? Even if not at the presidency level, who are we going to vote for our governors, for our members of parliament? That is what civic action in a constitutional democracy also requires. It's not just about revolution.
So when there is a summary of this particular conversation, in the same way that Mandela would have said, you know, some Mahatma Gandhi, education is the key to everything. We've got to educate our people. Kamotho Waiganjo is saying that for the Kenyan condition to improve, there must be more civic action. She must do something.
There must be more civic.
Must act.
There must be more civic responsibility.
And I'm going to tell you that the people are not educated enough to understand the issues at hand.
Oh, but these people run families. These people run churches. These people run cooperatives. Why do we think they are good enough to run corporates? Who runs all the people? Run families. People run schools. Why is it that it's only when you get to government that we need to be re-educated again? We're not educated about how to run our families. How do we do it? Our families are more complex than government. So what I'm saying is that we need to enhance those responsibilities, the way we make decisions. That's why I quoted the local funeral committee in the village. Why do we decide who's going to be the treasurer of our local SACCO or our local chama? Why don't we use the same skills to say this is not public funds, this is not public resources, these are private resources. There's no difference between tax money and the banana stem, the banana tree in my garden. I would not allow people to just come and take it. Why do we allow it of public funds? So I'm just saying the civic responsibility that we need now to incorporate that we have not. And yes, rulers have responsibilities, institutions have huge responsibilities, but the citizen also, especially now as we head towards an election, we must ask very real questions.
Most of the time, Kamotho, the wananchi, the people, choose leaders whom they feel to be able, to be educated, to be conversant with the facts before them, and they're being let down at every turn because the judges are compromised, the politicians are compromised, everybody is compromised. Why aren't you turning this conversation and apportioning more blame to leadership?
No, by the John, I don't say that the responsibility is only on the citizen. I'm just saying leaders have a huge responsibility. Ultimately, the buck stops there. Ultimately, you've been given responsibilities. But I'm saying let us also not assume that the citizen is also just a victim, a helpless victim who is at the mercy of these people. We create a lot of these monsters. So I'm just saying, can we take a little more responsibility? Ultimately, and let's also recognize that we have examples of leaders that have done well. Let's also not just cast a blank and say nobody has performed.
I'm thinking.
There are people, there are leaders.
You're making me think of my feet.
There are leaders that have performed, and you've got to look at this even in terms of history. You look at our last 20, 25 years. Where have we come from? What have we done? What are the things that have worked? What has been the impact of leadership on those things that have worked? If you go around the counties today, there could be, 5, 10 counties that are doing fairly well, relatively, with very little resources. What is it, the difference between those places, and what is it that we can replicate? Those people are elected by the same citizens that live in the places that are elected all manner of, I'm not finding a polite word.
We'll go to a rubric now that takes the wananchi. We're talking, we're sitting together, having our friendly, fraternal conversation, and we're talking about Kenyans, ukabila, ethnicity, tribalism. If Kenyans do not have a shared set of values, how can they make common sense on how they should be governed? Because the understanding, Kamotho, is that all the machinations around the BBI are to ensure and stabilize and concretize tribal, ethnic feelings of legitimacy. Comment.
Yeah, it is. I think part of BBI's attempt to craft a framework of national leadership, which has what you call a Kenyan face, and that's a contested term.
Yeah, we don't know what this face looks like.
Is to recognize certain of our unfortunate realities that for now, and I hope it is not forever, we are still very tied to ethnic identity. So that when I look at the national face, that automatic thing is to look who represent me there ethnically. It's unfortunate, but a significant part of our population looks at the world that way. And that is informed by a history where ethnicity and a king at the top who was from ethnicity came with benefits. So of course I want to keep seeing that there. One hopes that with time that will change. But in the meantime, to keep us together, can we at least try to move from where we are at to the next place, which is the ideal? So that is what BBI tries to do. And I think that process, for as long as people feel excluded, you cannot tell them to create national values and national principles. People first want to feel they are part of this whole. Once we are part of the whole, can we now have a conversation about what is the value of this whole? But for as long as we feel we are excluded, we don't want to be part of that conversation. So part of building national ethos and values is inclusion. Inclusion at leadership and inclusion at resources. The reason why BBI increases 35% revenue is to say the money that will make a difference, even if it is lost, even if some of it unfortunately is lost, is the money that comes to the grassroots. Then everybody feels part of this whole. Then let us have a conversation about who is Kenya.
Well, do forgive me. I think that the whole, it's an unfolding sort of matter before the court.
That's true.
So we don't have enough time to sort of write a textbook on the BBI. But I will come back to the Mwananchi. I will come back to Wanjiku, Atieno, Farida, and say that they are the victims of barbaric governance for 90% of the time. They don't have faith in their institutions. We don't have faith in our cops. The policeman scares me. The army soldier scares me. Everybody who's there out to protect me scares me. how do you inculcate the feeling of the rule of law in this climate of fear and trepidation?
I think it's a process, and to be positive. And I think as I grow older, I tend to be a little more optimistic. I remember a time when everyone feared the police. Now, police brutality, we write about it. It appears in the news because it is not the norm. So we've also got to affirm the developments that have happened that are positive and keep demanding more. I don't think the situation is as bad as it is defined. It is sometimes that the evil stands out because it is loud. But the only reason evil stands out is because it is not common. If it was common, it wouldn't be news. So I'm just saying, let us also affirm the bulk of policemen, by the way, who are hardworking, very poorly paid, living in poor conditions, but they're the ones who stay in the rain and guide us. They're the ones who come when there's violence and expose themselves to violence. That's actually the bulk of the police force. Are they bad posers? Are they horrible when they exercise illegal power against the citizen? Of course. But let us affirm that that is not actually the definition of the police force. That is, even in leadership, I don't think the definition of leadership in Kenya is just evil. I don't think so. I think we've got some good, which you need to affirm.
Agreed. I think the people, you've been a very articulate apologist. I mean, we could sit for a long time to unpack that particular statement, but the perception that the law is the enemy of the people. Again, this idea, I saw a woman on television the other day saying that her daughter had been killed. Yeah. She was weeping and wailing, gave a half-hour interview saying there's no justice, the lawyers are taking money from her, and she swore that she was going to spend every breath at whatever age she was to make sure that justice was done to atone for the extrajudicial killing of her daughter. We go back to this idea the rule of law is to be instituted at base level by which segment of society? Because I'm still coming back at you of do protest, do be civic, but the Wananchi are being clobbered.
Yes, and the truth of the matter is that ultimately, and we must never be apologists to bad systems. I don't think that is. I think the reality is that there are times when the law goes wrong. That lady's story is unfortunate, and that is the dark side of when the rule of law collapses. Because when the rule of law collapses, then it becomes a rule by men and women out there. And the risks to that, the sort of instability that can raise, should send a message to any progressive government that it is in your interest for you as leadership to be seen to be respecting the rule of law and to ensure that it is obeyed. But again, is the reason why that story stands out, because increasingly, that is the outlier, increasingly. And what we want to do is to ensure that even that outlier does not exist, that our courts are functioning well, that our courts are delivering justice. We are not there yet, but it's a journey, and I think we're getting there. But and Kenyans, we have every right to demand very high from all our leadership, a lot from our leadership, because we judge ourselves. We don't judge ourselves again. We used to be told to judge ourselves against broken down Somalia. We judge ourselves against the best in the world, and so we will keep demanding more. But even then, we must never sell the narrative that all is gone and all is wasted, and we are a desert of injustice.
Right.
Yeah.
Kamotho, I know you well enough to put a fairly personal question, but I'm also going to let it reflect upon me. And this is the whole idea of identity.
Yes.
If I have a name that is Okumu and belongs in associated with a certain region, a certain ethnic group, Waiganjo, another certain ethnic group, does it mean that the individual, the Kenyan, they'll say Kamotho Waiganjo will speak in such and such a manner because of his affiliations? He must be pro this government. John Sibi Okumu, if he does a presidential debate, he is going to favor a certain candidate because of his provenance. Are we intellectuals incapable, if we have friends who are Asians, friends who are Chinese, friends who are Japanese? Do you think this accusation is that we can't think for ourselves is founded? That I am incapable of thinking beyond coming from a village in Western Kenya?
I think it's an insult to assume that. I think let us first accept one thing, that we have certain automatic inclinations. And I think that the beauty of any intellectual is the ability to recognize that instinctive attachment to a particular worldview and not to assume that it doesn't exist. There's a way I see the world. There are glasses I have worn since I was born. I cannot pretend that they are not there. What I am is that I'm not enslaved to them. That's a difference. I am willing to accept that there's a way I view the world which would be probably kinder to those who I identify with, ethnically or otherwise. But I also am strong enough to see where they make error. Yeah, I can see where they make mistakes. And I think where we will move forward is to stop pretending, to not pretend that we don't have those instinctive reactions, but to say now that we have filed that away, how do we still see beyond that, but not to assume that it doesn't exist. Our ethnic identities, where we come from, they define our worldview, they define the way we see the world. But part of being an intellectual, part of being a thinker, is to move away from that, is to move above it. It is not to pretend it does not exist. That is dishonest and it is not true. And so what people do is we're having a conversation here. We're pretending to have a conversation here, but a conversation actually here. I think if we agreed that we have this conversation, and if we put it away fast, then it makes it easier for us now to raise our conversation. My concern is we pretend to be talking here, but we're talking here. And this is the conversation that we always need to have as a nation. What is the impact? Why is it that the people in a particular ethnic group identify with the leader of that ethnic group? It is not because they are evil. We need to understand that, unpack it. It will help us move to the next level.
I'm going to ask you one last question that brings us back to our beloved continent.
Yes.
Going back to Africa, I'm just going to make a statement, slightly pernicious, I'm aware of it, but I want you to comment. Despite the imperialist borders, is Africa, in essence, one country with hundreds of different peoples, speaking hundreds of different languages, beset by the same problems forever?
The part I would disagree with is a forever. Like I said, I'm an optimist. Africa has come from very far. Unfortunately for us, we don't have the luxury of centuries to grow and develop slowly like others had. You have to get up running very, very quickly. Yes, we are actually one country in a sense. We have the same realities, we have the same challenges of environment, we have the same challenges of population, we have the same challenges of disease. And I think one of the challenges that as African leadership, one of the things that African leadership has not done is to exploit the benefit of being that geographical one. Africa is Africa's largest potential market. If there's anything that COVID has taught us, is that we can get locked in this geographical area and that we must depend on one another. How do we monetize that? How do we convert that? I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that politically, but I think there are many ways in which we can exploit our oneness, our one countryness, at least economically, by growing better transport routes, by ensuring we have more dynamic trading partners, trading relationships, by ensuring we remove barriers. That is what is going to make us a powerhouse, an economic powerhouse. For as long as we keep to be protective around our puny borders, I think we have no future. So in a sense, we need to recognize the beauty and the power of treating ourselves as one unit, albeit divided by some boundaries imposed on us, but which are political realities. But that does not mean that we cannot exploit the benefits that we have economically, including the huge resource base that we have, which now people are coming to exploit because we are not exploiting. So there are benefits from being one, but it is not going to be done. We do not have outward-looking leadership, but instead we have inward, insular leadership. Yeah.
We have to end there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kamotho. Thank you, Mudhoniwa.
Asante, John.
And thank you for being part of this conversation on Pass the Mic, Let's Talk, an initiative of the African Center for Ideas program through Jade Communications.